So welcome to my presentation called Web Accessibility in Practice. I actually gave this presentation for the first time a couple of years ago. I put it together and presented it at a meetup in Perth. Since then I've actually presented it at the last place I worked as well, so some of you here have already seen it. If Mark's here, I think he was here. James is here. Lee's not here today, but he saw it already. But yeah, so I've done it a couple of times before now. So for a little bit of background, even though I'm a developer, I've always had a bit of a sort of a natural talent with design, and I've been inspired by great user experiences. In a previous role, I joined a team, and it was in a project, and I was given sort of the responsibility of the user experience while I was there, and part of that was sort of the accessibility, being in charge of the accessibility as well. I didn't know anything about that. I barely really know anything about user experience. I just sort of am really passionate about it. Didn't know anything about accessibility, so I was thrown in the deep end a little. And this presentation is just sharing my learning experiences. So what is web accessibility? Basically, it's a set of recommendations or guidelines, I guess. They come under this WCAG 2.0 sort of grouping. There's basically a massive spec that tells you how to correctly implement an accessible website. I don't personally see the list or the guidelines themselves as concrete, but that being said, as difficult as it would be to implement all of them, any one that you do implement correctly greatly enhances the experience and assists users with limited access. So who are we talking about? Basically, traditionally any person who has any level of blindness or low vision or photosensitivity. It includes people with any sort of learning disabilities, cognitive disabilities, anyone with any sort of deafness or hearing loss, anyone with limited motor movement or any speech impediments or disabilities. But also, we're always designing for everyone. So, because like an accessible website improves the experience for all users. So this is an image taken from Microsoft's inclusive design documentation, and I think this is really interesting because Microsoft took the traditional values around accessibility and decided to tackle them with a much broader scope. As you can see, basically there's a scale here. It slides from any sort of permanent disability to anything that's situational. So you can see how this would affect anyone. It's not anyone who's a new parent, it's anyone who temporarily might not have access to one arm at a time. Imagine you're on the bus and you have to hold, because you're standing up, you have to hold onto the rail. You will only have one accessible arm. I think this is really interesting, and this is really quite profound. It basically increases the scope, and it makes you think about accessibility in new ways. So for me, in my case, the project I was working on was for the state government, for the Department of Water. Basically, it was a public-facing website, and any public-facing website for the government is bounded to the piece of legislation called the Disability Discrimination Act of 2002. It mandates that we have to achieve a certain level of accessibility for the customers. And in my case, it was from the perspective of applications development. So the application we were building didn't have heavy use of images or video or audio, for example. So we could ignore the accessibility requirements that related directly to that. So I'm going to go over the fundamentals. Basically, there's three levels of accessibility. You have A, AA, and AAA. And these levels are cumulative. So if you need to target AA, which was the case for the government website that we were building, you also have to meet all of the requirements of A, for example. And if you're on AAA, you have to meet all three. It's also split into 4 principles. And the interesting thing about this is you can kind of read these like as a test within itself. So you can ask yourself the question, is the particular page or element that I'm building, is it perceivable? Can it be seen? Is it operable? Can it be used? Is it understandable? Can it be understood by my users? And is it robust? Is this the same for all of my users? these are the 4 focus points that I want to cover, because these were the most important for me in the application that we were building, and they had the biggest effect on the accessibility. So getting right into it, contrast. Contrast is about designing elements with strong contrast to assist users with limited vision. Here's an example here. You can see that in order to meet a AA requirement, we need a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1, and a AAA requirement requires 7 to 1 contrast ratio. And as you can see, if we don't meet that, it actually makes it quite hard to read this text. Imagine if it was a lot smaller. This example here that fails has a contrast ratio of 2 to 1, and it's definitely not enough. As an example, as a real example, I tend to avoid putting placeholders as my labels, because as soon as we decrease the contrast, those placeholders, which are our labels, disappear, and we can't tell in this name field here which one is meant to be the first name, middle name, and last name. It might be implicit, but if you're using a screen reader, it might not be easy to tell. There's lots of great tools for contrast. It's actually one of the most, I guess, well documented, because it's quite specific about what contrast is required. There's this tool here, but in actual fact, since I last gave this presentation, Chrome now supports it out of the box. You can put in a background color and a foreground color, or it can detect it and tell you immediately what contrast ratio you have and whether it meets AA or AAA. Next up is color. So color is about enabling users with limited vision to distinguish information on your page using more than color alone. So this is a subtle one, but can anyone tell me what might be wrong with this? The green? Oh, this one here? That's a good guess, but in actual fact, if I take the contrast off, like make this completely black and white, the problem here is that you can't tell the difference between the colors of these 2 buttons that are next to each other. It's not too bad, because we've actually put text inside the buttons that describes that. If maybe they were just icons or something like that, it might not work too well. But we can improve that. We can make that better. So for example, if we use a primary color for our main button and use a more subtle color for the additional options, you'll actually find that as soon as we make that black and white, it's really clear which one's which. As another example, can anyone tell me what's wrong with this? It might actually be hard to tell.
Can't see the links.
Yes, perfect. So in this case, this is a link and this is a link, but for some reason we've turned the underlining off. I guess sometimes designers think it looks quite nice and subtle, but as soon as there's no color, you can't tell where the links are. So all we have to do there is return the default state, which is to put an underline on our links, and it's now much clearer. There's a couple of really cool Chrome extensions for color. I'm actually going to show you this one. This is called No Coffee, and this simulates various visual impairments, especially various stages of color blindness. So interestingly, up to 50% of the population may be affected by some sort of color blindness, not complete color blindness, but these 3 different types here. So what I can actually do, I'll use the No Coffee extension, and I'll pick a color deficiency like protanopia, for example. And we can see that there's now almost no distinction in color between anything in the top 3. That was yellow and red, green and red, and then green and yellow. I'm just going to pick another option as well, just to show you. So this is called, also commonly known as red-green color blindness. So go back to normal and I pick tritanopia. And as we can see, I think this is called blue-green color blindness. The bottom 2, blue and green, and blue and purple, I think. Yeah. this affects up to 15% of the population from what I've heard as well. So this is a really, really important one, and it's something that you can benefit a lot from checking. Another extension that I like to use is the high contrast extension. This simulates the high contrast modes that are available in the operating system. So you can see what that might look like on your page to see if you can support that properly. So you might have noticed the little icons that I set up here. I've actually made them themselves accessible in that using more than just color alone, you can tell the difference between each one of the three. So for example, obviously there's text in each tree, that helps a lot. I haven't just used a color as a key or anything like that, but also I chose a different shape and I've given one a strong outline, so it's quite clear. If I turn on the extension, we can see that it's also quite clear in an accessible mode. This is the inverted color mode. I've chosen colors deliberately that invert in a way that's still quite clear when the colors are inverted. We can try different modes here as well. So in a grayscale mode, I've used sort of a gradient of colors, so it's still quite clear the colors that are different there. I can play around with different modes and I can see that they all work pretty well. Next I want to talk about focus. So focus is about designing visible focus states so that users with limited vision or a limited cognitive ability can maintain focus on what they're doing. So basically the problem here is that change of focus can be disorienting. Basically any change of focus at all should be user driven if possible. For example, we want to avoid having elements appear and disappear that aren't a direct result of user interaction. And we also want to avoid stuff like pop-ups. We all hate pop-ups, but basically in the case of an accessibility audit, it's not ideal. Basically anything we should be doing that is a change of focus or things sort of appearing or not appearing on the page should be an expected behavior and as a result of a user interaction. So taking, for example, this page, this isn't too bad. So this is the result of a user interaction. But as you can see, anytime we change either this radio button at the top or this drop down here, large sections of the page appear and disappear. An alternative to this would be to just disable the fields, avoid custom controls that replace standard controls. So talking about stuff like a styled checkbox, for example. I'll show an example in a second, but anything that overrides a standard control that the browser supports natively. Also avoid really complex controls where they're not necessary. So for example, like an autocomplete or a combo box with lots of features might actually not be necessary. We might be able to get away with a drop-down box if the number of options isn't too large, for example, or we don't need the ability to search. Also, make sure to use the tab index where it helps. Your browser will arrange a tab index automatically for you, but for example, you might want to move your tab index in such a way that the forgot password button is after the login button because it's an interaction that's used less often. So in this example, you can see we've used a custom control here for a checkbox, and what happens is because the custom control has no keyboard driven focus state, when we hit the tab key we jump straight to this link, then here, and then the next button, and we can't actually select the checkbox at all. The solution is to use just the standard native checkbox control. It's got better support, and as it might not look as pretty, we can't do as much with it. We can't style it in as many ways as before, but it will work for all assistive technologies. On top of that, I've also changed the tab index for these links here so that they're after the next button. That gives you the option of, after the next button, continuing to hit tab so you can read the statement, terms and conditions, or the privacy policy, or the acknowledgement and consent, just because I see those as less common interactions, like the forgot password button, for example. So yeah, to summarise, basically elements on the page should have strong contrast. Information should be indicated using more than colour alone. Users should be able to focus and not have their attention interrupted. Design with keyboard use in mind. Basically, accessibility shouldn't be thought of as a barrier to innovation. It shouldn't force us to make products that are ugly or boring or cluttered, but hopefully allow us to explore new ideas and make our websites more useful to anyone. And I don't think we should use the excuse that I'm not the designer, I can't make this decision. This isn't really about design so much. I think this is accessibility isn't for designers, it's not for hippies or anything like that. I think that accessible design is more about rules and measurability, and developers and engineers love rules and measurability, right? I think we're all responsible for making the web a more inclusive and accessible place for everyone. Thank you. Yeah, I had to use this option so I could click the no coffee button. I know, that's a little bit distracting.
In terms of accessibility?
Yes?
How do you think this is mostly about front-end for web dev? How do you think it differs from developing accessibility to games? And what are the unique challenges that you think might present itself?
In this example, I was mostly talking about the web, but if you think about colour and contrast, for example, that applies to anything, obviously. And even like keyboard accessibility, there are usually ways in the standard frameworks for whatever you're developing in to intercept the tab key and make sure that behaves the same way. And like I said at the start as well, I focused on 4 areas. That the WCAG guidelines are actually quite large and they cover a lot of things, and they're quite agnostic. I focused on the 4 areas in this presentation that I was more dealing with day to day when I was trying to make our websites more accessible. If you want to learn more about that, have a look at the web accessibility guidelines, because there's lots of stuff, even though it's for the web, and the examples for the web as well. There's lots of examples in there that you can actually use and apply to anything.
Cool.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yeah?
Going back to the checkbox example, I was wondering how a user would know to keep tabbing after the next button, but would their screen reader read out those 2 lines so they know there are links there, and then once they've got to next, they know, well, I know there's 2 more links, so 3 more links. If I just keep tabbing, I'll get to them.
Yeah, a screen reader, because this checkbox, the label that is associated with it is this text, it will have read out that text and explained that that's a checkbox.
Will it define that those 3 links are links?
Probably not. So this isn't the best example because we obviously want all of our users to read the terms and conditions. I don't agree that all of them do. Okay, in that case, true. They wouldn't know that the access to that link is after the next button though, so that's not ideal in that part. Sorry?
They'll at least know that it's there.
Yes, they will, yeah. Yep.
An interesting thing about screen readers is people who use them regularly have them pretty fast.
Yeah.
And if you listen to the speed they listen to it, it's amazing. They can actually...
It is really interesting to watch. Yes?
Do you know if there are any tools that you can use to scan your website and give you a rating on accessibility or anything like that?
Yes, there's actually heaps. So, for example, the new one that I like is Google's put together a website called web.dev, and you can put in your own website as the URL, and it will scan not only accessibility, or scan performance and all that, but it's got a pretty good gauge of accessibility in there, and it gives you a score out of 100. I think these are great tools. I think they catch a lot of things for you, but if I go back to a previous example here, it's the color example with the 2 buttons. Keep going. So it'll pick up examples like this where it knows that you've provided a link and it's not underlined, and it goes, well, that's easy, you should underline all your links. But if I go back to this example, it's not going to know about the context of these 2 buttons, and whether or not them being next to each other is going to cause a color contrast issue or a grayscale issue. So I think those automated tools will help you pick up a lot of things really quickly, but they're not great for covering everything. And I think it's important to know sort of the fundamentals of this stuff, so you can not miss out on these opportunities as well. Yes?
So all your examples are in AA. Is AAA just a lot harder or less visual?
AAA, I see it as if you're designing a website that's specifically for someone with like really specific accessibility needs. And I think browsers are there to help you as well a little bit. If you get to a AA standard, you're reaching kind of like the 99%. If you're using anything in the sort of AAA area, you're designing for really sort of specific use cases and doing really sort of really specific things too. If you want to read more about it, and if you want to have a look at the AAA areas, there's some interesting things in there.
Probably worth mentioning that WCAG 2.1 I think is out or coming out.
Yep.
And that's mostly about dealing with responsive design. So if you've been making responsive websites, you're already okay with 2.1, but it wasn't really stated in 2.0 explicitly around mobile use.
I think there's some things in 2.1 as well around kind of the more cutting edge technologies as well. So WCAG 2 came out years ago now, so I think it's almost 10 years ago or more. And since then, we've created all sorts of things with the web, like single page apps that do really complex kind of stuff, and it tries to compensate for a lot of those things as well. I think there's a section in there on VR, from what I remember. No more questions? Thanks, guys.